All right, so I'm Dave Sika. I'm on the board of directors of the Early Television Foundation. I've attended every meeting of the Early Television Convention since we had the first one in 2003. And I guess I can say that I still attended every one because even though I missed this year's meeting, we didn't have one this year because of COVID. The board of directors decided to cancel it, as just about everybody else decided to cancel everything else. So we were talking about how to try to make up for that in some degree, and the board came up with the idea to hold monthly online meetings instead of an intensive once a year weekend thing in Ohio, and maybe turning it into a regular get together, make it a little bit of a more like a club. So in the spirit of trying to turn lemons into lemonade, we're hoping that maybe we can even continue to do this online get-together after we return to in-person meetings, whenever that might be. My thoughts were, if we can leverage the strengths of a virtual meeting, we can do some things here that we couldn't do at the museum. And one of the ideas that was put forth is showcase private collections. People cannot drag their stuff, most of it, to Hilliard, Ohio. So everybody thought that was a great idea, and here we are. Tonight's meeting is going to be in two parts. The first part, we're going to introduce the Early Television Museum in case anybody doesn't know about it or hasn't had a chance to get there. And then we're going to have our first member showcase. And Darryl Hock has graciously agreed to showcase his spectacular collection as our first guest presenter. Okay, so now a little commercial here. So what's the cost of this shindig? Zero. We're not charging anybody anything, which is a significant savings compared to going to the convention. Because even if you don't fly in from Australia, even if you just drive in like I do, by the time you get done paying for the gas and the motel and the registration and the dinner and whatever, you got over $500 into the weekend, as opposed to absolutely free here tonight. But we would appreciate your support. So because the work that the foundation does benefits everybody in the vintage television community. So please consider becoming a member. Or if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, just go to the Early Television website and use the donate button. Send over a few bucks to say thank you. We will put it to good use, I assure you. I have one reminder or one favor I'd like to ask everybody. If you don't have your name up on the screen, if you could go to the participants menu and click on the rename and put your first name and your last name in there, that would help us in several ways. If you want to ask questions later on, if there's Dave's iPad, that doesn't really tell us who's there, and if there's 10 Daves, well, that doesn't help us much either. So that would be appreciated. Okay, so at this point, I will introduce Steve McVoy, the founder of the Early Television Foundation and Museum, and the current president. Steve?
Thank you, Dave. I want to give special thanks to Dave for arranging all this. This is a bunch of work. We all really appreciate what he's doing for this. I think it's a great idea, and I think it's going to be a benefit for the collecting community. Also, if anyone has questions or comments during anything I'm talking about, how do they indicate that?
Oh, yeah, I didn't mention that. On your screen, and it'll be a slightly different thing depending on what type of device you're on. But there will be a under a more submenu, usually 3 dots. There'll be an opportunity to click a button that says raise your hand. Let's see. No, on my iPad, it's not under more. Let's see. I can't tell because I'm the host. I think perhaps if you go to your name and participants, or Google Google how do you raise your hand in Zoom meetings. But if you raise your hand, I will hopefully see that you've raised your hand, and I will unmute. I will ask you to unmute your mic and ask the question, or you can use the chat feature. There is that is under more. You can open up a chat window, and then you can send the chat message out to me. I'm in there as host, and I will relay that message to Steve and try to keep this thing from coming off the tracks too badly tonight.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the history of the museum. I know many of you are this is going to be boring because you know it all, but I thought for the newcomers it would be a good idea. The museum. I started the museum in the foundation actually in 2000, and the museum opened at the beginning of 2001. So we've been in operation for almost 20 years. In the early days, it was funded by myself and my family. But as time went on, more and more income came in from memberships and donations and various other sources. The convention auction was a major source of income. And finally, about 3 years ago, it became self-sufficient. The budget is about $60,000 a year, up or down, depending upon what's going on. But that's our basic operating expenses. And it's covered by all our sources of income, which is really nice, which means the museum can continue into the future without any financial worries. We have a board of directors that is extremely active. I think I've seen a good number of the board members are here tonight. They make it possible for this for the foundation and the museum to continue. The museum itself is about 6,000 square feet, located in Hilliard, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus. And the display area is around 6,000 square feet. We also have a large warehouse area. The collection consists of, one time, everybody asked me how many sets we have on display. And I've always estimated 150, and I've never counted them. One day we had a group of third graders in there, and their class project was to count how many TVs. And I'm sorry to say I don't remember what the result was, but it was above 150. Many of them are operating. We have push buttons at various places. Probably when Larry does the tour of the museum, he can show you. We also have an audio tour system. In each area of the museum, we have a short audio description of what is in that room. And also on the walls, we have signs indicate that tell what you're looking at. At each set, there will be information about it. In May, we had to close because of the pandemic, as everybody else did in Ohio. And we were able to reopen in July with some restrictions, which were really not too difficult for us because we don't have a huge volume of traffic. We've been open since then, and when Larry does his tour, we'll show you some of the things that we're doing to keep people safe. But there is another tightening of restrictions in Columbus. It just went into effect. So far, they haven't announced any closures of public facilities, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. And if it does, we'll have to shut down again. But I should mention that through the pandemic, even though we don't have we were required to cancel the convention, which, as I mentioned before, is a source of income. We've done fine financially. People have stepped up with memberships. We have about 185 memberships so far this year, and we'll be starting a membership drive through our email accounts and so forth at the end of this month for next year. And we started 2 years ago a sweepstakes where the grand prize in both cases happened to be a RCA CT100 color set. And in both years, last year and this year, we raised over $12,000. So that replaced the lost revenue from the convention. So even if the convention, if the virus continues for a long time more, we're still financially fine. I hope, like everybody else, that by next fall, maybe we can have another convention, but certainly by the spring of 2022. Okay. Does anybody have any questions, by the way?
Yes, I have one, Steve.
Yeah.
What's the usual turnaround time between dropping off a check in the contribution box in the museum and when it should appear on my bank account? I visited back in late September, and I dropped off a check in the contribution box, and it still has yet to appear on my bank statement.
Well, it usually happens. We usually process the stuff within a few days. So obviously you fell through the crack, and then I will get with Larry and figure out what happened and get you get it taken care of.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Okay, well then let's move on to the tour. And from now on, we're going to switch the video over to Larry, and I will introduce him.
Yeah, what's Larry logged in as?
It was like a Samsung phone, I think.
Larry's going to be the troublemaker, huh?
Yeah, right.
There are 2 Samsungs listed.
Yep. Larry, can you turn your microphone on and say hi?
Hello, can you hear me?
I do hear you. So let's see.
Okay.
Hang on, wait. Now I have to grab the Samsung that has the microphone on. A little detective work here. And okay, and there's Larry.
Oh, man, look at that face. Okay.
Hey, you got a face for radio.
Oh, goodness. Thank you.
Hey, Larry, I don't think you need your mask unless there are other people in there.
I've had it on all day today. We have had people come in. So it's just, and plus, for those who don't know, I do work at a hospital Monday through Friday. So I'm just used to having a mask as a part of my wardrobe. So,
okay. Well,
you probably got some snacks hidden in there too.
There we go. All right. There we go.
All right. This is Larry McIntyre. Many of you have met him on your visits to the convention and to the museum. Larry has been with us from the very beginning. He was our first and only employee, and he runs the day-to-day operations of the museum. I have been in Colorado since a year from August. So what's that, 14 or 15 months?
Something like that.
Something like that. It wasn't intentional. I had medical issues first, and now I'm scared to come back to Ohio because of the COVID situation. So I'm going to continue to stay here for a while longer. But during that period, Larry has done a magnificent job of keeping the museum going and dealing with all the issues that come up. So we really appreciate him. Now Larry's going to take us on a tour through the museum. First, I wanted to show you some of the COVID precautions we take. Larry built us a plexiglass screen in the front office so that he was safe. Can you show that, Larry?
Yes. Let me turn that around right there. There we go. There you go. So this is the plexiglass. Can you hear me? This is the plexiglass window. We have masks that were donated by a museum board member. So we do have masks that we do pass out to people when they come in. I haven't had any issues with anyone not wanting to wear one. Everyone has been very nice and very polite and very understanding. So that's always nice. We actually have some information from the governor's office about museums and symptoms that we have taped to the counter. And you can't really see it, but I'm going to open the door here. And I'm going to show you just from this side. We also have documentation on the door. So when people come to the door, they can read it. It talks about wearing a mask and the symptoms and all those things that people would need to know before they come in. I think I've only had 2 people actually come to the door, read the sign where it says you have to wear a mask, and they actually walked away. But other than that, the majority of the people are very compliant, and there's been no problems.
Excellent. Okay.
All right. So I'm just going to close that and lock that back.
Good. So now let's go back to we're going to take you through a brief tour of some of the highlights of the museum. We're going to start back in the mechanical room.
Okay.
Larry is going to be taking us there.
All right. I won't be speaking anymore, so okay.
Okay, all right. Okay, as you can see, we have a bunch of sets on display in our mechanical room. Several of them work, including this first one, which is our Baird televisor. Really the first. Larry, let's focus on the, that's fine, but focus on the Baird here. There we go. There's the Baird televisor, which is really the first mass-produced television set in the world. About 1,000 of them were made, we think. Ours works. We have a signal source for it, and visitors can see it in operation. The next one I wanted to highlight was the Western Empire State, which is later toward the end of the mechanical era, 1933, and it is a lens disc set with a crater lamp that projects an image onto a frosted glass screen. This set also works. Now let's turn around and go into the flying spot scanner camera that we have. Now this is part of this is old. To your right, you will see a photocell. Larry, go a little bit to the right.
Oops, sorry.
You're upside down.
I know, sorry.
No problem. Okay, this is a photocell dropped out.
Oh. Sorry. There
now
we go.
You're back.
There we go.
This is a photocell cabinet, one of 4 that we used by RCA about 1930 for their mechanical experiments. And the subject for those experiments was Felix the cat. Why don't you put the camera up on Felix? There you go. That's not the Felix that was used, but that was a doll that was commonly available at the time. Now go back to the projector part of it. There you go. Now that is something we built, and it's with some modern and some old parts. We are making arrangements to get a more authentic flying spot scanner. It's scanner camera. We expect to have that in sometime this summer. Okay, let's move on to the British pre-war. And we're just going to I just picked a few sets that are sort of interesting for you to look at. This is a Kosser 1210, which is about 1937. And this is unusual in that it has a 15-inch picture tube. And maybe, Larry, can you show a side view of it?
I sure can.
Look how deep it is. Really sort of ugly. So now let's move over to the Kosser 137T next, which is right next to it. This is the earliest electronic set in our collection. This is from 1936, and it has a 12-inch tube in it. Both of these 2 sets are restored and working. Okay, let's go on over to the HMV 902. Wanted to show you this as an example of a really elaborate set. The HMV made a whole line of sets. I'm going to show you the bottom of the line set in a minute. This is sort of the top of the line. It had a magnifying lens on it. It has a 9-inch tube, and it made the picture look quite a bit bigger. And it has, in the lid of it is a phonograph. And it also has an AM radio built in, shortwave radio built into it. Okay, let's move over to the HMV 904, which is sort of the bottom of the line. This has a 5-inch tube in it, again with an AM shortwave radio. Now, that's the reason for that was that the BBC only broadcast a few hours a day, and if someone invested in one of these sets, most of the time they'd be using it for radio, listening to radio. Only one channel, so none of these sets have channel selectors. Okay, let's move into the American pre-war room. And Larry's just going to pan around, starting with the RCA TRK-5, which was the cheapest of their sets. And he's just going to pan around and show you what we've got in our collection. Darryl's collection is so much better, and so he's going to be sharing it, and you'll learn a lot more about American pre-war sets. Great. Now to Nipper. This is on loan. We were showing Nipper's rear end first, but this is on loan to the museum from Dave Arland. And I mean, Dave, are you on?
I am on, yes.
Why don't you talk about it?
Well, just briefly, Nipper, of course, was the famous terrier who actually came from England. He was part of the His Master's Voice painting way back when in 1901. He was painted by a scenic painter named Francis Barrade in England. And the famous story is that Barrade first painted that painting with an Edison cylinder phonograph, tried to sell the painting to Edison, the Edison company in Britain, and they weren't interested. So he took it to what became Victor talking machine, painted out the Edison, painted in the Victor machine, and the rest is history. RCA, of course, acquiring Victor back in 1929 after radio had pretty much done in the phonograph business. That particular Nipper was made by the same company that made most of them back in the 30s and 40s. He's almost 6 feet tall. He's made out of paper mache, believe it or not. And me and a few other people on this call used to work for Thomson RCA. And that Nipper was at the Indianapolis headquarters at one time. And when I acquired him, he had a tear drawn out of one eye because things had shut down. So I had him beautifully refinished and kind of antique looking, but that's the way he looked when he was new. So it's my great honor to loan him to the RCA room, so to speak, from 1939.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, let's head back. Are we set up again to move on? Larry, let's move on into the post-war area.
Larry's video seems to be freezing.
Why?
Okay, there we go. Now we're working. Okay, let's start with the RCA 621 on your right here. This was the first RCA model, along with the 630 that were introduced after the war. This is one example of many of sets from that era, 40, 46, 47, that we have at the museum. Larry, why don't you slowly move down that aisle to the down to the temple. A lot of you that are in the collecting field will recognize many of these sets as we're going by. This area at the end is our exhibit of 7-inch sets. This particular one I picked to highlight is the Temple TV 1776, which has a built-in oil-filled magnifier on its 7-inch screen. All right, down the other aisle to the Telejuke.
If I could interject here for a moment.
Sure.
This is Dave A. If Larry could go back a bit towards the back end, there is that Sightmaster set.
Yes.
The Sightmaster, that very bizarre sort of grandmother's,
Larry, do you know what he's talking about?
I sure do.
Okay. No, that is a very interesting set to me. The Sightmaster, there it is, that this very bizarre grandmother's, some sort of bedroom set. And this particular set in the museum is hollow. We have the cabinet, but no chassis. In my collection, I have the complete set, restored and working, and it may be the only one existing. And maybe someday it goes to the museum, but right now it's mine for fun.
Okay. Thank you.
And the construction internally is just the worst. It's a CRT on top of a chassis that is stacked up on some kind of, spindles and pins to hold the CRT up. It is just, I'm amazed the thing even works. And then, the chassis is, the electronics are so fragile. They're just barely operable.
Hey,
whatever they had to work with. I forget, what the original set was, but it was modified and pushed up to about.
We really need to move on. Thank you very much for your.
Go ahead,
Larry. Why don't you head back to the Telejuke? This doesn't photograph very well because it's all glass, all mirrors. But this was introduced in 1946 in New York City, before anybody had seen television. And it has a jukebox in it, and also at the top a 15-inch Emerson set. And you could put a quarter in, and you had the choice of listening to 5 songs, or watching TV for a half an hour. And during a very brief time in 1946, before anybody had seen television, people were willing to do that. But I think there's one more in bad condition of this that survives. All right, let's move down to the Dumont RA 101 Custom. This is an interesting set, very expensive. Comes in 3 parts: a speaker, a control of the chassis with the tuner and so forth, and the CRT, and it was designed to be mounted in the wall of your living room. Obviously, there had to be a closet there to get in to repair it because in 1946, sets broke down all the time. I think the set cost over $2,000 at the time. Okay, let's move on to the next row. Other end, Larry.
I might have a page missing here.
Okay. Well, I'll direct you. Go down to the U.S. television set.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Here we go. Gotcha.
Now, this again is the era is around 1946, 47. Again, before many people had sets in their homes, but restaurants and bars and clubs, many of them had these projection sets in them. This takes the cake for the ugliest set in our collection. It's Naugahyde. It has a 5-inch projection CRT in it, produced an incredibly dim picture. And I can imagine, and a lot of we have several of these projection sets in the museum, and most of them, when you open them up, the cigarette smell is just overwhelming. And I can imagine sitting in a bar in 1946, watching a baseball game. Everybody smoked back then, and trying to see the picture, which is incredibly dim, through all the smoke. Okay, let's move down to the other end. This is the Dumont Royal Sovereign, which was made in 1951. It's the largest set, black and white set ever made. It has a 30-inch picture tube, and it's really a monstrosity. It produces a really nice picture for its era. This again was an expensive set, above $2,000. Okay, now let's move back down to the Predicta. Here is the one version of the Predicta. There were a number of them. This one is the Tandem, which had a separate CRT and a separate box that contained the chassis and tuner and so forth. And down at the bottom, you can see this monstrous cable that you'd put across the floor of your living room from the CRT that you'd put up front to the control unit that you put by your couch or table.
26
feet
long, that cable.
What's that?
26 feet long, that cable.
Really? Okay, let's move on to, that's all I'm going to show you in our black and white collection. We're going to show a couple of things in the color room. What Larry is focusing on now is a Gray Research television station monitor using the CBS color system that, as many of you know, was competing with RCA in the around 1950 to become the standard. Both RCA and CBS were trying to become the standard for color television. CBS's system produced a beautiful picture, and this one works and does, and was infinitely superior in picture quality in 1950 to the RCA's system. The problem with it was it wasn't compatible with black and white TV. But the FCC did authorize broadcasts of the CBS system for a few months in 1951. This monitor came from a TV station in Atlanta. Now, next to it, we also recently, well, not so recently anymore, had one of the cameras from this system donated. And this is the camera head. That's all that was donated. It has an image orthicon camera tube in it. There's the lens over to the right. It's on, everything else is modern. We built a camera control unit for it. It also operates, and during the conventions, we demonstrate. People are able to stand in front of it and see themselves on field sequential TV. We have a number of other field sequential artifacts too, but let's move down to the. Next is I want to show you the RCA. Other way, Larry. The RCA prototype. RCA, after the CBS system in 1950, starting in around 1950, RCA started working on its compatible system, and there were several itinerations of their design. This one is about a 1952 version of what they were trying to do. This chassis was loaned to the museum by Nick Williams. He bought it on eBay, got it to the museum, and we restored it. Darryl Hock, who you'll see later, builds standards converters. And he was able to, from the documentation we had, build a standards converter that produced a signal for this. It's not the same as the NTSC system that we used. It was, as I said, an interim system. It actually produces pretty decent pictures. But by end of 1953, RCA had moved on to their system that became the NTSC system. Now let's go down to the CT100. And the CT100, of course, is the set that RCA produced in 1954, about 4,000 of them. And there were several other manufacturers that made similar sets using a 15-inch picture tube. These sets produced a pretty nice picture too. All right, let's move on into we're heading actually into the British and European room, but we sort of ran out of room in the color area. So in here is a very rare Raytheon set. We know of only one other that exists. There's a chassis also that exists, but this set was donated by a person in Chicago. It was owned by a engineer at Raytheon. Steve Kissinger and Darryl restored this thing, and at the last convention, they demonstrated it working. There's the back of it. It's a monstrosity. Has an upper chassis and a lower chassis. This uses the same 15-inch picture tube made by RCA. Now I'm going to show you a couple of European sets that are sort of interesting. We have a bunch of them on display. One of them is this really fancy Dynatron Ether Sovereign that has a phonograph and a TV set. This is from the late 40s. Really a magnificent cabinet. This is, of course, a top-of-the-line set. And then finally, the set that is probably the most popular with visitors is our Kuba Comet. This was made at the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s in Germany. This is probably around a 1962 model because it has because of the screen. Interestingly, as fancy as this cabinet is, the audio section you'd think would be really fancy because it's got, I don't know, half a dozen speakers, but it's actually very bare bones. That we haven't restored this, but I would imagine the sound is not terribly impressive. All right, let's move back toward the broadcast equipment room. Here are a bunch of more of the color sets we have on display. And then on the right-hand side up here, you'll see our picture tube collection. We have all kinds of strange and unusual picture tubes. Many of them were donated by Dave Johnson, who was a collector that passed away a few years ago. Now we're entering our broadcast equipment room, and I'm not going to go through a bunch here because there's just so much, but we have all kinds of cameras, including and other equipment. We have here's an RCA TK31, which was sort of the workhorse of the television industry from 1946 on into the 50s. We also have a TK41 color camera, the first commercially produced camera, but it's now being restored. The other thing I'm going to show you in this room is our mobile van. Larry, if you could back up and see if hard to get a shot of this because we've got there. That's a pretty good shot. This was sold by RCA to a number of TV stations. I'm guessing around 50 in 1949. This particular one was in Salt Lake City and was bought in the 60s when the Salt Lake station upgraded by a local educational station in Newark, Ohio. And they drove it out here at a top speed, I think, of 55 miles an hour. Had used it for several years for local production. They did football games and parades and things like that in Newark. Newark is a fairly small city, about 50 miles east of Columbus. Larry, why don't you peek inside? You can see that it has most of its original equipment. It had a microwave system for beaming the signal back to the television transmitter. You can see it's a pretty basic machine to drive. And it has, aimed toward the end, it has the original control panel with 3 chairs, one for the audio guy, one for the video guy, and one for the director. You can imagine this thing in Salt Lake City. You might have noticed an air conditioner on the back. That was a late addition. But before that, you can imagine in Salt Lake City, with all the heat this equipment generated, the poor people that did the production out of it, it must have been a miserable experience. This is on loan to us from the Ohio Historical Society, on permanent loan, I'm pretty sure. Okay, that concludes our brief tour. For those of you who have never visited the museum, it gives you an idea of what we've got. For those of you who have visited the museum, it might be sort of nostalgic to see it. So I thank you for listening and wondering if you have any questions.
Yeah, I've got one for Darryl Hock. Darryl, could you give a brief overview as to how the RCA prototype set differed from what NTSC evolved to be?
That set was CPA, which was they realized that NTSC, or what would become NTSC, was going to have problems with phase errors. And they knew Hazeltine knew that PAL was the right way to go, but there was no way to produce a delay line, a one delay line at the time. So this was color phase alternation, where they reversed the colors just like in PAL, only they did it on a field by field basis instead of a line by line. So you get the advantages of PAL, that there's no hue, no need for a hue, but you do get some artifacts from it, some color fringing and flickering because of the lower overall rate of the color alternation then. And then I forget, I think the subcarrier was at 2.2 megahertz, something around that, if maybe Steve remembers. It's a totally different frequency they were using.
Right.
Thank you very much. And along that line about the burst frequency, as I recall, when the BBC was experimenting with NTSC on using the 405 line system with NTSC, they were using a burst frequency in the 2 megahertz range as well. Interesting. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I think the burst frequency was actually in the 3 megahertz range. But
what was it? Boy, you know, you may be right, Steve. I don't remember.
Yeah,
now.
because I remember working to try to find the crystal for this thing.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you had to get the crystal.
But it's different from the NTSC.
You're right. It was 3 something. Yeah, the 405 was 2 point something.
Yeah, right.
If I remember correctly, it was high. It was like 3.8 or 3.9 megahertz. And they were depending on the phase alternation to take care of the asymmetrical sideband.
Yep.
Hi, this is Chuck Azar. You might mention when you went through all the television sets that round tube era, which stopped at about 50, and before they had rectangular tubes, and all of those older sets, even though some of them looked like they were rectangular because they were masked off to the original 4x3, but they were all round tubes.
That's correct.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
We can.
The predictor, that CTR cord for moving the CTR across the room, how did they handle, or what concerns were involved in the danger of passing high voltage through that cord, particularly since dogs like to chew on things?
Is there any? I have no idea. The design was awful. I can tell you that. But maybe there's a predictor expert on that could comment.
When I was in high school, I worked for a Philco dealer. We're talking 1964 or so, and these things were coming in all the time. And I went on a service call to fix one of those things where the dog had chewed into the cable. The dog did live. The cable did not. A replacement cable was around $100, as I recall, at that time, and you could buy a 19-inch portable TV for roughly the same money, or maybe $20 more or something. So they opted not to fix it. We took a ton of those to the local town dump. That was before it was something you wouldn't do now, but that's where a lot of them ended up, in the landfill. Once that cable got broken on the high voltage lead, it would arc forever, and you could try all the Corona dope and tape and silicon. You'd try anything, it would arc. If it didn't arc today, it would tomorrow.
Yeah, that high voltage cable had insulation around it in a tube, and on that predictor, and it really held up fine as long as nobody bit into it.
Yeah, that's true. It was a separately insulated wire, kind of like a high tension lead on a spark plug. It wasn't quite that heavy, but still, once it was perforated by a nice canine tooth, and it just had that perfect amount of bounce to it that dogs like to chew on. And I think maybe the smell of the stuff had something to do with it too, but they did like to chew on it. And I imagine that Bowser got a real surprise when he bit into it.
Only once.
That's true. Only once.
And the dog's name was Sparky.
About a more general question, I've been to the museum, and I know you push buttons and turn them on the TV, and it's usually the same video signal throughout at least 3/4 of the museum. How do you pass it through? Are you broadcasting it, or is it coax? Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, or how's it going? Because there are different eras and different kinds of TVs, so I'm curious.
Well, we have in our closet, we have our video playback, and it's all done on little $40 things you buy on the internet that you plug a thumb drive into, that you've got your video programmed on. And we have four different separate distribution systems by coax. So the British Room has one, the American pre-war has one, the American post-war has one, and the Color Room has one. So we can play different program materials in each one of them just by changing what's on the thumb drive that we plug into them.
We use a
Steve,
ton
the
of
name was Micca, M-I-C-C-A.
That's what we're using.
MICCA. They're $39.95 from Amazon. So
they're wonderful.
Yeah, they are. We've probably got 20 or 30 of them in the Broadcast Museum in Texas, and they're great. And if one craps out, who cares? $39.95.
Appreciate that. I wasn't sure if we were broadcasting them or if they were being piped in through coax. So thank you.
Any more questions? Well, then, Dave, why don't we turn it over to Darryl and let's see his presentation, which I'm really looking forward to.
Well, don't get your hopes up too much, Steve. I don't have anything formal planned. We'll just kind of wing it and see how it goes.
You think any of us do?
Okay, so let me switch the camera around here. Get the light on. So we'll start out in here. And the stuff's kind of, this is sort of, I know, Steve, how you started the museum was the stuff was scattered all around your house, and it is still scattered all around my house. So, the typical 630 post-war 46 set. The one underneath, this one here is a Jenkins from 1928. This is a 48-line version. There was a 60-line version too, just changing the disc. Most of the mechanical sets, they worked on two different principles. Either the transmitter and the receiver used synchronous motors, and they had to be tied to the exact same mains circuit, or you had one that you have a phonic coil on it. And what that was really just a smaller motor. So the main motor would bring the speed up to where it was very close to the right speed, and then the phonic motor would pull it in that last little bit and hopefully keep it in sync. Some of the phonic motors work a little better than others. I'll show you a mechanical set, different one operating. It's a little hard to show these operating. They're pretty finicky, especially like this Jenkins. It takes it forever to stop hunting and finally settle down. This is a synchronous version, not a phonic coil. So we'll skip that. TRK-12, you saw that earlier when Larry was going around. This was the top of the line RCA set in 1939. It was introduced at the World's Fair. It's mirror in the lid, and the reason these early sets, you'll see not all of them, but the main RCA and GE were mirror in the lid because the CRT, it's a 12AP4, 12-inch tube. It's very long. It extends almost to the bottom of the cabinet. And as Steve had showed you on that one Kosser set, it would have been ridiculously deep if they had made it a direct view set. So this was a way to kind of make the cabinet a little more compact. And he had the advantage that with the mirror, it did kind of block the overhead lighting a little bit and gave you a kind of a wide area view. So now, even though I do converters, I don't have converters on every single set, so we're going to have to drag one around on a couple of the sets to show them.
Darryl?
Yes.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I have noticed that several people are complaining about the fact that they're in gallery view and can't see.
Yes.
So only it's a small screen. So if they click up in the upper right hand on the view button, they can change it to speaker view, and that'll pull up Darryl.
Correct.
Or there's a button on the left-hand side of your screen that'll do the same. An icon.
So you can put your hands on it. All the company's so serious about it.
So that's the radio. We'll get the TV warmed up. So I don't know how much time you guys want to spend on each set. Obviously some of them are going to take a little time to warm up. I can give you a little bit of backstory on them. This one came out of Temecula, California, back in about 2001. Looks like we got some nice tearing there a little bit. Now, if you remember, Steve, this is a set that it was in that junk shop in Temecula where your 7-inch mini console set came out.
Yep, I remember.
So this was the top of the line RCA at the time, and these are, I believe, are still by far the most pre-wars that are still out there. Something like 50 or 60 now you're up to, Steve, I think. So definitely a lot of these
maybe even more than that. I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly either, but these definitely by far have survived the most to the present day. And they produce you can get this set is not restored. It looks like there's been some capacitors changed in it, probably in the 40s, maybe 50s, early 50s. So it's not the best operating set, but it's one that I just leave as is, more as a time capsule. And the fact that it does run, is pretty amazing. And,
so that's running 441 lines now?
So basically I'm running a converter on all the pre-war sets to run 441 and AM on the ones that are still AM audio. Nope, that's a little washed out. So not the best picture on it. Again, it's not restored. It's just, kept around and functional.
Hey, Darryl.
Yes.
81. We have 81 in the database now.
81. Wow. So yeah, it's even grown more. There's nothing even close to that in the database.
No, nothing anywhere near it. Right?
Yeah. So they're a nice set. They're pretty iconic. Obviously, that it's the one that was shown mostly at the World's Fair by RCA in their building. If you've seen there's pictures of a gallery with many of these sets lined up where people could walk through and view them, and that's where the Lucite set was, so people could actually see the inside of it. That it wasn't they weren't trying to pull a fast one. One of the sets I'll be showing you a little later. It has also a tie-in to the World's Fair. So again, if anybody has any questions and want to see something specific as we go along, just interrupt, and we'll go back and talk more about the set. On the other side, we've got GE's top of the line set for 39. This is the HM275. Which is an interesting set. GE made these, but they never actually sold them. Not quite sure why. It seems like somewhat of it is that it was a little too much, possibly, and GE wasn't as pushing the sets as much as RCA was pre-war. It's an interesting set in it's the top of the line GE, and it comes with a radio like a lot of the sets did. It comes with a 3-tube radio, and one of the tubes is the detector. So it basically has oscillator converter and a single IF in it, which seems strange for a top of the line set, but perhaps they were thinking they were just going to sell these in New York City area, so it really didn't matter that they didn't have the greatest sensitivity or let me get the light off here maybe on this, now this set was restored. Actually, this set was how I met another member, Chuck Azalina. And actually, Steve, you were involved in that. We were all bidding on this set on eBay back 2001 or so. Let me turn it down a little. 2002, it came up. And Chuck ended up winning it and restoring the set. And then many years later, I ended up getting it from him. So the set's been through a couple of hands here. Turn the light back on so you can see it a little better.
Come on now, sit down. I'll get you a nice cold drink.
So another thing on these sets, this is an actual HM275. Now, what GE did when these didn't sell is they pulled them back, and with some slight modifications, they upgraded them to FM sound from the earlier AM sound and some other minor changes. And then they relabeled them as Musiphonic M90s. And they literally just took the M90 sticker and stuck it over the H275 sticker. Usually they're not on quite straight, and you can still see the H275 sticker underneath. So they just basically repurposed the sets and resold them as M90s in 41. So I think there's about the same number of 275s and M90s that are still in existence right now.
I knew they'd have to be a fight away in here. All right.
Again, if somebody wants to see something different or ask anything as we go along, but we'll get to more interesting sets as we go along too.
I'm now going out the door again.
Okay, let me grab the converter. And like I say, as Steve knows, now we start trouncing through the house here to different rooms to see. You're going to see a little bit of a blackout here as we move to a different room and I get the light turned on. So bear with me.
One of the reasons that the museum exists is that my wife wouldn't tolerate sets all over the house.
And that's how it is still here right now. It's sets all over the house. So here is some more. This is an ICA mechanical set. This came out at an auction, the Stanton auction in Michigan a few years ago. I think there's one other of these at the museum in Toronto, MZTV. Very basic set. It was sold as a kit. You got just the pieces. Everything was optional. The lens was optional if you didn't want it. And this is just a synchronous set. No phonic coil. 48 line set. Now the set underneath it, that's a prototype GE. No information out there that we've ever found on it. It's a 7-inch set. It's got a RCA CRT and an RCA yoke in it that they sold over the counter to experimenters, which is kind of odd, but I guess, GE had no choice at the time. They had to go with what they could get, but no information on it. Have no idea. There's no nomenclature on it. There's no markings on it. The knobs are off of the 37, 38 style GE, so it had to be around that era because then by 39, they already introduced the actual pre-war series. So, what that's off of or what that was for, we're not sure. It's very rudimentary inside also. The chassis is just bent and folded sheet metal that they soldered the corners on. They're not overlapped and welded, nothing. It's very poorly put together. So it looks like just an exercise for them to what potentially became the HM171. So let me go ahead and get that fired up. Now, all the tabletop 5-inch sets pre-war were all television attachments. So they were designed with no audio in them, and then you used whatever radio of the time, tabletop radio or console radio that had typically phonograph inputs, where a lot of them were starting to actually label the inputs as television attachment, just more of a marketing type gimmick at the time. So it couldn't have saved them much money. It had to be more just a gimmick. We have documentation from GE that there was an HM171 that had audio in it. There's schematics for it. There's pictures of it. And it looks like at the last minute, they dropped the audio out of it, possibly because they heard that's what RCA was doing. So they did the same thing. Philco did an interesting thing. The one surviving Philco pre-war tabletop, same thing. It's an attachment unit. It doesn't have audio built in, but they broadcast the audio at 8.25 megahertz over to an adjacent radio. So it was a wireless audio in it, which is kind of neat. All they were doing, actually, they were just taking the IF out of the audio and just broadcasting it. So they didn't do any trickery or anything special. Now this set next to it here, get over, maybe move it over a little bit. This is an HM226. Now this is an interesting set in that it's a 12-inch, but it's a 12-inch direct view. So as I mentioned downstairs, the TRK-12 and the GE 275 were both 12-inch mirror in the lid because of the length of the 12AP4. This uses a Phillips 12-inch tube. And I'll show you an example of the 9-inch version later to show you the difference of it. But the tube is actually fairly short, and they were able then to put it into a direct view position like this. So you'll see too that it works surprisingly well. So it's really strange why they used the 12AP4, why, RCA, obviously they were the big gorilla in the room at the time, because these Philips tubes are really wonderful. They work on the right channel here. They work spectacularly. I mean, look at that picture. That is the original CRT in that set. Now, this set belonged to W. Baker, who was the vice president and manager of the television division for, let me get some video on that, for GE pre-war. And this was his set. So it actually was modified by the factory. It has some really strange IF coils in it that are non-adjustable, and it's been modified at the factory for FM sound. So obviously they were keeping his set up to the latest standards as they were changing. But that picture is every bit as good as a 12AP4, and it's not half as short, but it's quite a bit shorter that obviously you can get it in a direct view and not have a exceedingly deep cabinet. So very impressive on Philips' part. At the same time that RCA was making the 9AP4 and the 12AP4.
I've seen some babies in my day, but you are a champ.
It's a very, very impressive pic. Now, it couldn't have had many hours on it because there's still no ion burn in the CRT. So I don't know if they maybe changed the CRT, towards the end for him, or, he just didn't have it on hardly at all. Hard to say. Above it is a Baird that's under restoration, same as the one Steve had. The insert side, the mechanism has all been restored. The cabinet still needs to get painted.
Do you know what the deflection angle of this Chuck Azar? What the deflection angle was on that tube?
No, but I can't remember off. This is an MW31 because it's basically in centimeters, and I'm going to show you an MW22, which is the 9-inch version, and you'll be able to see the difference. It's a very short angle. I'm guessing probably about 60 degrees. It's
thin neck or thick neck?
Thin neck. So very, very advanced. And like I say, now they're magnetically focused as well. They're not electrostatically focused like the 12AP4 and 9AP4. Just really impressive technology that Philips had. And it's weird. So GE is the only one that sold sets here with those Philips tubes in them. So GE had two 12-inch sets. They had that 275 that I showed you before with the mirror and the lid using the RCA tube. And then they sold this one at the same time with the Philips tube. So there had to have been something going on at the time, I don't know what, but, it seems like they were probably putting themselves into a bit of a predicament with RCA buying tubes from Philips. I know that I believe Jeff Lindero had theorized in one of his articles years ago that they were doing it, GE was doing it on purpose to put pressure on RCA to get them good tubes. And then, basically saying, hey, well, we'll go to somebody else if you can't provide for us. So very, very impressive with the Philips. Now over here is, and Steve has one of these. I'll show you this one operating now. This is a 1929 RCA mechanical set. I'm going to have to bring the tripod down a little bit to get you lined up to it. So this is a fairly elaborate. Well, I just dropped my iPad. Hang on a second. Unclipped out of the tripod. Okay. So this is a fairly elaborate. This is the amplifier section for the neon lamp, and you can't see there's a very large GE motor in there that you'll hear when it fires up. It's loud, and then a shortwave radio chassis all the way at the bottom. This is a repurposed RE45 phonograph cabinet from Victor that they just basically, if you look back here, this is where the radio originally was. And then the phonograph was sitting up here. You can they actually just filled the holes for the original lid support and just basically pulled cabinets off the line and used them for this purpose. So let me grab the video source here. Unfortunately, yeah, I don't have it feeding around like Steve does. So let me okay.
You got quite a few of those converters there, Darryl. You must have gotten a good deal on them, huh?
I do have quite a few converters. I don't have one on every set, so like I say, I got to carry one around a little bit tonight. But let me get some different content for this. So now this set is running. Let me turn that off so we don't have to listen to the tone. This set is running. You can see the orange. Well, yeah, the orange dot right now, and you'll fire it up. So it's pretty darn loud, the motor, as it spins up. And I might get my head in here. I got to basically align the video. This is a synchronous motor style set. So let's put on, and it's probably, let's turn the light off, see if we can see anything. Nah, is there a way to zoom on this thing? Zoom in? Let me just pick it up and bring it closer.
Yeah, not so much. You zoom with your feet.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, you can see it there a little bit. Now, let me get to something, different content here. And let's, okay. Now, one of the neat things is because this is my converter and it is a LED, not a neon, I can change the color to black and white or to full color. So a little bit of cheating there, obviously. That wouldn't have been like that originally, but it's definitely fun to play with.
Darryl, what year is this again?
Yeah, hang on a second. It's so loud I can't hear. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, what year did RCA make
1929. So RCA built these, but it wasn't for them. They built these for CBS, who was doing some trials on television for themselves. So RCA built these for them. Steve actually came across the schematics for the transmitter section of this whole system that RCA created. So it's pretty fascinating to see what they were doing, even for other companies at the time. So although it's an RCA set, it was never used by RCA. But as I see, it's very loud. I can't see anybody actually getting too much entertainment value from the noise it makes as it runs. Okay. Let me get into the next area here. Okay, so in here we have all the RCA 5-inch pre-wars. So there's the TT5, the Westinghouse 700, the Silvertone. Both of those, Silvertone and Westinghouse, were made by RCA. They're just TT5s in different cabinets. And they did that just so that those companies had something to show at the World's Fair. They were never sold, either the Silvertone or the Westinghouse. And then over here, the TRK5. We can go ahead and actually fire all these up. Now, I do have a feed on these, so we can actually get multiple ones running at the same time. Let me plug the video in. And getting back to my video. Okay. Don't need the audio on all of them, I guess. It'll all be the same. This is a prototype set that came out of the cabinet shop. The chassis doesn't have any nomenclature on it. The area where the sticker went, it just somebody in grease pencil marked TT5 on it. And the cabinet doesn't have there was interlocks on all these sets because of the lethal high voltage in them. They all use mains derived high voltage that is basically lethal. So they all had interlock switches on the back. This cabinet never had the interlock switches installed in it. There's no holes drilled for it. So it was just used for prototype. And we'll get this one going too. Let's see, I don't think we can get them all in one shot here. Yeah, almost. And I'll just go around as we. You take it and hold it here again. So there's the TT5. The Westinghouse, actually, they look a little better on the iPad than they do in real life. The 5BP4s are horrible CRTs. They don't have much brightness at all. And the silver tone. Having a little trouble there focusing. There we go. And then the same thing, they all used an attachment radio for the audio.
The picture's a lot sharper on the 5-inch sets than on the 12-inch sets, of course, too.
It's, the spot size wasn't that great on the 5BP4. There we go. So the 5BP4s, turn that down. The 5BP4s leave a lot to be desired. They're dim. They're not that great a focus, and they don't. At least most of them now that you find are pretty weak. There was Fair Radio in Ohio, had a whole bunch of them, NOS ones they came across many years ago. So those actually seem pretty good. They're fairly bright. Lose a little brightness there. So can't you see watching your favorite show on that?
Your grandfather's version of watching it on your phone.
Yeah. And, it's still better than anything, nothing at the time, although these sets were around $200 at the time, so it was still a lot of money for not much of a TV. And then the TRK5, which had the radio also built into it. See if that one will come to life here. I should mention, I did let the smoke out of two of them getting ready for this, but it wasn't too much problems.
You know the two types of vintage televisions, Darryl?
Yep.
The ones that have failed and the ones that are in the process of failing.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, RCA on their 5-inch console, they gave you a radio, and you'll see in a minute the GE didn't for some reason. They obviously wanted to cut corners, and you just got the 5-inch TV, console TV. So when there was nothing to watch, you didn't have the set on. How are we doing here? I mean, should I, spend more time, less time? Anything different?
I think your pace is fine.
Okay. I mean, we're going to get to some more interesting sets that we'll be spending more time on too as we go along. So let me go ahead and shut these off.
Oh yeah, those sets aren't interesting at all. I wouldn't want any of them.
Well, you know, I mean. Okay. Yeah, I will eventually get at least these sets are all running off of one converter, a little more like Steve's setup, so it's a little easier to demonstrate. Okay. In the main room here, let me grab the tripod. Okay, get that back on. Hopefully I won't drop that again. Okay, so I had mentioned the Phillips tubes a little earlier, and there's the two 9-inch. Hang on a second, this thing's gonna fall out again.
Just don't let it fall on the tubes.
Yeah, I'm far enough away. So there's the two tubes. So that's the Phillips 9-inch and the RCA 9-inch. So you can see, I mean, the focal distance, you know, the deflection is considerably different between them. And you'll see this 9-inch tube in a set working. They produce a great picture. They have an interesting thing. They put the exhaust tip on the side of the bell on all theirs. So kind of a little different arrangement. All right, so then we have the TRK9. Let me get this cranked up a little. So this was RCA's 9-inch version then of the pre-war. And let me get that. Now, not to say that the 98P4 doesn't make a wonderful picture. It does. It's obviously, you know, you look at the depth of this cabinet now, it's a pretty impressive cabinet for a 9-inch TV. But right away, these tubes make much better picture than the 5BP4s. I guess he's right. I apologize. This set was also restored before I got it, although I did some. This is one of them that let the smoke out. They left the original wet electrolytic in the radio power supply chassis, and it went up.
Darryl, did any of those 5-inch sets you have use a 5AP4, or were they all?
The only person that used a 5AP4 was Andrea. And I did have an Andrea at one time, and they do make a considerably better picture, the 5AP. And the same thing, it's shorter. It's not terribly shorter than the 5BP4, but it is a shorter deflection, and it makes a better picture. But then again, the 5AP4 I had was an NOS one. But even compared to NOS 5BP4s, it still seemed to make a better picture. Part of the problem, the 5BP4 was used during the war for radar use. So there are a ton of used war surplus still, you know, Jan ones out there. And I don't think there was much, you know, consideration for quality on them. The color of the phosphors all over the place, the Dumont ones, they're not quite yellow, but they're just this sickly off-white color. And just like I say, very inconsistent on them. And if we can, we'll spin around. And now that's the 5-inch GE console. Now this didn't have a radio and only a 3-tuner. Basically, it is the chassis from the 5-inch tabletop. The only thing they did is they added an audio output tube, because obviously this has the audio built into it, whereas the tabletop didn't. The tabletop has the holes in the chassis for it. They just didn't put it in, where this one they did. Let's see if that, gotta plug it in. So although this GE, I think, saved you about $20 it was, it's kind of not as good a deal probably as the RCA was with the radio. I mean, that radio is a pretty high-end RCA radio of the time. So you got a good radio with your set. I don't know how good that, let me take one of the lights down here, see if we can make it a little.
Jackie Gleason, The Honeymooners, with the stars Art Carney, Audrey Meadows, and Joyce Randolph.
Now this is the 9-inch GE that uses that 9-inch tube that I just showed you. So this is the same thing. It's a Phillips tube, and you can see now this cabinet, it's fairly short. I mean, it's not bad at all from a normal radio of the era. And it also produces a really good picture. Now, again, none of these Philips seem to have a bad ion burn in them. I don't know if that's just they didn't get used. They're not aluminized, so it's not like they wouldn't suffer from it. But this makes a very watchable picture, even in a normally lit room. Now, when it makes a picture, you got it plugged in right now. Oh, hang on, I forgot to plug the.
Work. I bring these tights and slippers and I bring on them and I sweater them. I make them real comfortable. And when you get a I bring it on them. It never fails. Well,
I mean, that's a very, very good picture for a direct view, fairly normally lit room. Again, though, it's odd, no radio. Just at least you got a 5-channel tuner in this one, but no radio. And this one uses that Philips MW22 CRT as well. They were kind of interesting GE. They used on their high voltage supplies, which are all brute force. RCA just did a single, half-wave rectifier from a 6,000 or 7,000 volt transformer, depending on what the set was. GE used voltage doublers on all their bigger sets. The 5-inch are all just 2,000 volts, so they're single stage. But they use voltage doublers on all theirs. And the other thing is these Philips tubes are only running at.
Darryl, I accidentally shut your microphone off.
There we go. How long was I out?
2 seconds.
Oh, that's weird because I didn't touch it. I wasn't even.
No, I did.
Oh, gotcha. So yeah, anyway, so these CRTs are only running at 4,000 volts, whereas the 9AP4 and 12AP4 were 6 to 7, and again they produce a really acceptable picture. So very interesting. The GE went with them. So this is the only 9-inch set the GE made. They only used the Philips tube. They never made a 9-inch with the RCA 9AP4. Okay. We'll get to some a little bit more interesting here.
That was a remarkable difference between that screen and the ones before.
Exactly. The 5 BP4s are just they're not good. they're pretty lousy tubes. But yeah, all the 9-inch up sets are very, very acceptable. to what we would think is a normal image today. Okay, so now this is one of the RR359s that was made in 36 for the original field test. This one's unique in that it's the Russian version. So let's open it up here. The controls are all in Cyrillic. So in 36, because of actually a little later, because these sets were made in 36. So originally this was the RR359A. This is the RR359A1. And because of Zworykin's ties, obviously, with Russia, he set up a 100-set system in Moscow for them to evaluate and see what they were doing with television at the time. So this uses an RCA 1800 CRT. It's a 9-inch CRT. It's the predecessor to the 9AP4. So physically, it's almost identical, except you'll see it's got a greenish, yellowish phosphor on it. This was just before they went to the white. Give it a second here. All right. Where's the picture? Oh, it's coming. I don't know why it's coming on so slow. There we go. The picture is kind of lousy. I think I have a different CRT for it, another 1800. Usually it's a little better than that. There we go, a little better.
Is that before they started using the P1 and P4 designation?
Yeah, so they didn't have the P1 out at the time. So this is a more greenish version of the 1800. Then I've got one that was just after this where they were trying to get towards yellow or white, and it's more of a yellowy green. It's nowhere near white, but it's way less green than this. It's kind of a sickly pea green, it's pretty icky looking. But now an interesting thing on these sets, these controls up here, they have the horizontal width, centering, speed, vertical width, centering, speed, and this is the focus control. Because the power supplies are all sitting down in the bottom of the chassis, and this set is running at 6,000 volts, brute force. The focus supply and the high voltage supply are completely independent of each other. Have nothing in common. They obviously didn't want to run, a 2,000 volt focus lead up here, have to isolate this control and then run it back down to the CRT, which is, the socket's down at the bottom. So what they did is there's a completely separate, there's a high voltage transformer, rectifier, and then filters and big reactors to filter it out because it's all at 60 hertz. And then they did the same thing for the focus side. There's a smaller high voltage transformer, rectifier, filters, and reactor. This control is a 25 watt rheostat that all they're doing is put it in series with the primary on the focus transformer. And that's how they were able to adjust the focus voltage without having high voltage come up to the user service panel. The bad thing is they're not ratiometric. So as one shifts a little bit, the focus doesn't necessarily track right.
Darryl?
Yes.
Quick question for you regarding the test that Zworykin did in Moscow. Given that the Soviet Union was roughly 220 to 240 volts at 50 hertz, any idea how the broadcast standards may have differed? I presume that the U.S. version of this was on the 343 standard.
The same thing. It was all 343.
And how did they make any modifications, particularly to the power supply,
Nope.
to accommodate the 50 hertz?
Nope. These weren't. These were run at 60 hertz over there. So I've got some, and I can start bringing some of that. There's some documentation that I came across in Danny Gustafson's estate here. Let me shut that off. Let's see if I can get the tripod back up again to get on this a little better. So the two pieces of documentation I could find directly about these sets. This was just in a package of documents, and it's the program of tests for the two Moscow receivers. And it goes on what they wanted to test on them and how they were configuring them on these two for whatever reason that were, I guess handled differently than the rest. And then there was some, it's not in here in this packet, the actual tests that some technician went through on the sets. Let's see what else was in the original. Now this isn't specific to the Russian. This is specific to the RR-359A in general, which this set is identical to for the most part, other than the writing on it. Okay, it was in the other. Then, oddly enough, in a different, where is it? Here it is. In a different set of documents, this was on the RR-359 projection TV. Now, I can show you a picture of that. It's basically one of these RR-359 sets, and they put this gigantic box on top of it in place of the lid. And then they had a weird looking projection tube on it. But so this is the documentation for that set, high definition production set. For some reason in this, at the bottom here, they talk about the electrical circuits in the receiver are similar to those in the 100 receivers supplied for the Moscow installation, but with several improvements. The bandwidth of the pictures are blah, blah, blah. So I don't know why they specifically mentioned the Moscow installation at that point, but that was pretty well known that Zworykin had set up 100 receiver setup for Moscow for them to try out. And that was this set was in 1938. So one of the guys who was involved in these sets was Robert Holmes, and his little binder of photographs here is a pretty good documentation of the stuff they were working on. Just every chassis from every angle, different, obviously this looks like the timing generator for the transmitter. There's this goofy projection set. So you can see it's an R359 with this whole section added on. The projection tube's up in here. You can just kind of see the edge of it pointing down at a screen. Never seen one other than these pictures, but obviously some were made, but not apparently demonstrated anywhere.
Darryl, I understood that set was demonstrated at the 39 World's Fair.
Was it? I've never found any pictures of it anywhere. It could have been, and you think it would have been.
Yeah.
But I've never found. I've got a lot of different pictures of the World's Fair and back rooms in that, and I've never seen that thing. But you would think it was there. So there's this weird projection tube that they made for the. You can see it's a fairly large glass envelope. So it looks like it was actually like a giant beach ball with a plate suspended inside of it, almost like an iconoscope in reverse. This was
the Baird projection tube that we have in our collection from 30.
Yes, yeah. So this looks very similar to that.
Yeah.
Yep. This is a projection set, pre-war projection set that's more like a regular projection set. It uses a projection tube and ran at about 40,000 volts at the time. I think there is one of these known to exist someplace.
Yes, I think MZTV has it.
Yes. Yep. And
Darryl?
Yes.
That set with it lens on top that looks like a prototype Dalek.
On which set?
That's back one. That one.
Mm-hmm.
That was used at the first television exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
Well, this set or this assembly here?
Style.
Oh, that style. Okay.
And before they went to color, it was a black and white TV exhibit. Mm-hmm. And they had this projector in a small room with black curtains and a maze you had to enter because the picture was so dim. It took your eyes a couple of minutes to adapt to it.
Interesting. So yeah, I don't have to go through all this, but Holmes took pictures of everything, and we'll get into RCA was big in facsimile, which you'll see. Here's an R359 being used as the receiver part for facsimile, which predates these sets by quite a lot. Now there are some pictures in here. These are all the R359s. This is the 366, the tabletop 5-inch version, which has never surfaced. But obviously at least one was made. Let's keep going here. Different 5-inch sets. Power supply for the 359. Is this one of them? Yeah, so this now is a Russian set. You can see the same Cyrillic writing. So this is one of the sets that they had made to go over to the Moscow. All these now are the Russian set. Now it's interesting. This one actually has the meatball in Russian. If it'll focus there on it. Now the set I have didn't have that on it, and I debated putting it on, but I left it original. But I thought that would be kind of neat to have the Russian RCA meatball on there. So just lots of different flavors of the 359 sets that they had made. The 9-inch, and we'll see a 12-inch here in a second. The power supplies, different cabinets, different lid configurations. The tabletop 366 again. That in the data sheet, or the technical sheet on this one, they complained that it was getting way too hot in the cabinet and something would have to be done in production. And you can see it's crammed in there pretty tight. And I think in here he has some of the earlier, getting back into the earlier 30s sets. A lot of these sets, at least I've never seen any of them ever surface. This is some 5-inch set. This is an earlier 5-inch tabletop set. This was actually 1940, I believe. They were doing how low cost of a set can we make? And they actually made a version of this in a plywood cabinet that's just, hideous to really cheapen it up. But they were trying to see if they could hit a $200 price point at the time. Interesting set. Again, none of these, I've never seen them show up anywhere. This is interesting. It's R359 basically laid out on a little, roll around workbench. So how they were doing their prototyping at the time. And CRT, another 359, another prototype. I think that's about it for that. So now, again, there's a couple other different, let's see if we can find a picture of a different. This one was interesting. It's a 3-chassis set that the CRT went down through a hole through all 3 chassis, and there you can see it. So it goes down. Oh, sorry, 2. It goes down through the chassis, and again, that's another one that nowhere to be found. Obviously, these though were made in very low volume, probably just for a 1-off, 2-off for an engineering sample. So then over here, this is an R359B. Get this back down a little. So what they did, that was a 9-inch. The R359A was a 9-inch. They pulled them back and turned them into 12-inch sets. So they did that. It's all the same chassis. They just took the chassis out, repurposed them. They had to put a different, assembly in to hold the CRT. And you can see on this set, this is a little bit later 359B. Some of the early ones, you still had all 7 user controls. This is a little bit later. They folded the width and centering on each side down inside. So they're actually underneath the deck board because they figured that really wasn't going to be needed to be a user adjustable item. The other one had a continuous tuner. This one has a detemp tuner in it now. So just slight changes that they made along the way. The interesting thing about this set is this was the master set that was used to drive the sets at the World's Fair. One of the things with these early sets, there's no RF amplifier on them. So the local oscillator is basically spraying out the antenna terminals. And it's really difficult. There was quite a few service articles you can read in the magazines of the time where a guy would go out for a customer complaint about interference, and it turned out it was his next door neighbor, and the antennas were basically radiating into each other. So what they did for the World's Fair, and if you've seen the picture, there's some risers, and there's a line of TRK-12s and then another line of them on the next riser up. They were all driven from this set. I don't know if there was more than one of them. I assume there had to be a backup or something. So Steve, on his site, you can see they had to do modifications to the TRK-12s, obviously for line level inputs, because they weren't running them off RF. And he's got a picture on there of a TRK-12 with an extra chassis in it. And that was they wanted it, they didn't do distribution. They must have known about how to do distribution correctly at the time over coax. But what they did is they just made high input impedance amplifiers in each of the sets and then just daisy chained this signal to them, which I am skeptical, I guess, on how well that would have turned out. But let's go ahead and fire that set up so you can see it. Now, this particular set, I'll show you here in a second.
I heard they sold the TK41s that they used in the World's Fair after the World's Fair. It'd be interesting to know if remnants of the modifications to drive them off of a single receiving set identify the ones that were former World's Fair sets from the ones that were production sets.
I would think so. If there's any remnants of that chassis in there, then I think that would be, fairly conclusive. And there's very clear pictures of that chassis and where it mounted and how it, not necessarily how it hooked up, but there are schematics available for it too. So it probably wouldn't be too difficult to figure out if it was one of those sets. We have
a chassis from a set that was allegedly at the World's Fair that has a voltage doubler for the high voltage. And the story we were told is that they used the voltage doublers to make the pictures brighter for the demonstrations.
Correct. Yep. So what they did on this set, and I can show you here when we get to it, because we have the original schematics. So this came from an RCA engineer out of Indianapolis. Dave Ireland knows him. And he had gotten the actual schematic. And what they did is they took the RR359 schematic, it's an E-size sheet, and they stuck pieces of paper over the sections that they were going to change. The audio section isn't much. They basically just added another detector and feed it through a transformer out. The video, a lot of these sets have prototype tubes in them, the 4000 series, which were prototype receiving tubes. It's just a 6AG7, basically, or what became a 6AG7. And they used it as a cathode follower, so basically a low impedance output to drive the signal to all these TRK-12s that were at the fair. Now, this set has a 12AP4 in it, but this is the tube that would have actually been in it. So this is the prototype for the 12AP4. Chuck Azalina got me this. That's a dud, unfortunately. But you can see it's very similar to the 12AP4, but it's much more bulbous. And that shape there in this set, there's a metal cone that the CRT is setting in, and it's that shape. So the 12AP4 fits in there, but it doesn't contact the walls. There's spring members in the walls to hold it centered, and it doesn't even contact them. So it really was supposed to be that too, but I don't know. I think there's one we know of that actually works, and then this dud. But let me see here. So on here, it's probably going to be a little hard to see. So this is the schematic. It's getting a little bit fragile here. And let me get this off the tripod. So up here is the original audio. for the set, and it actually has single plate 2A3s. Both these are 359, so I'm sure the audio fools would love that. It has that, open ambient sound. So what they did is they just basically created another detector and then put it through a transformer and out the back. So the cans they're using, they're probably about 3-inch diameter cans and about 4 inches tall, and they screwed them to the bottom of the chassis, the two of them, and that, just to do the modifications, and then they put the extra holes in. So now this is where they actually just, if you get the original 359 schematic, the original circuitry is here, and they just pasted this over it. And what they did is they put and again, this is the preliminary 6AG7 as a cathode follower, and then created the video line output to the sets. So this control is actually under the front service panel that they could set the level. So kind of an interesting set. It's getting pretty hard. Let's see if you can see it. So master receiver, if you can see the name of it. So kind of an interesting backstory on that one. Back in the tripod. And last, the 31 set. So this set, some of you may know, some of you may not. Again, it was found by an RCA engineer in Indianapolis. He had been working there a few years and had heard about a warehouse that was getting cleaned out in Indianapolis, and went over there and saw this set laying on its side with a big piece of tape on top of it that said scrap up on top. All the tubes were missing out of it except the CRT, which is a prototype CRT from 31. So he went to his bosses and said, you guys need to save this or do something with it, or, just don't throw it out. And basically at the time, nobody had any interest in it. So he grabbed it, and it's survived till today. Now, this set was fairly well documented in a series of IRE papers, because this is the first electronic set that actually made it out of the lab by RCA. There was a couple of sets before this one I can show you pictures of in a bit, but this is the one that made it out and actually went to field testing. So they wrote some IRE papers on it, discussing every aspect of it, the transmitter, the receiver, doing field test measurements, interference measurements at people's houses where they were located, and basically just getting a lot of information on the set. It's 120 line, 24 frame. So, it's good. It's much better than mechanical at the time. And maybe slightly less finicky. It's a very finicky set. It actually runs, and it's basically just been conserved. The engineer played with it back in the 80s. He tried to get it to at least create a raster. He knew he wasn't going to be able to put any video on it because there was nothing to generate the video at the time. But he thought if he could get a raster on it. So he had played with every chassis is individual on it. There's a horizontal deflection, a vertical deflection, a picture receiver, audio receiver. So he just played with the deflection chassis, and all he did was change a couple resistors out, but he kept them and labeled them. So basically, I just put it all back to where it was. So it's all the original capacitors. And again, this is 31, so they didn't use electrolytics at the time. There are a couple electrolytics in it, but they're not in the power supply. They realized at some point that 24 hertz or 24 frames a second on 30 hertz mains wasn't such a great idea. And they got obviously poor problems obviously with synchronization and rippling. So they created a little chassis in there with 6 of those copper Mershon capacitors. Basically 3 pairs. It's actually, they just created 3 20 microfarad capacitors to put on the cathode bypass of the first detector, the first amp, and the output amp in the video section, just to try to keep the ripple out of them. The power supply is just like most of the sets at the time, they're film capacitors. So it's all still the original film capacitors in it. So, and just like Steve, the Felix was also used on this set a lot. One of those, when Steve went through the mechanical room there, and he showed you that one case with the big reflector in it that was used for the mechanical testing, that was still used for testing this. They did not have a camera out for this set. So they used still that mechanical equipment. Again, it's all written up in the series of IRE papers that are readily available. They created a giant wheel to create as a sync generator. So they didn't want to have the wheel spinning so fast to create 120 hertz pulse for the 120 line pulse for the horizontal. So they actually came up with a clever system where they only do 60, and then they got a cutter wheel in there where they alternate back and forth between two different spirals, so they could keep the speed down on the wheel at least a little bit. But this set was driven from a mechanical scanner. It was never driven from an electronic camera, as they didn't have them at the time. So this is a 9-inch set. It's a prototype tube on it. You can see, I think Steve's got a picture of the tube up on his thing. There's a big paper stuck to the side of it with the test data on it. What voltage they ran it at, what brightness, what the grid voltages were. And basically they sold these tubes to RCA licensees if they wanted to mess around with television production. No safety glass, so they weren't quite as worried about it, I guess, at that time. Easy access, since you obviously had to be playing with it quite a bit. It's basically, the construction is all 1929, 1930 RCA and Victor. These cans are real typical in all the RCA Victor radios, the standard transformer cans. Some of it is unique, obviously, like the tuner section, the audio, because it's two separate. So this is the sound receiver. This is the video receiver. There's no, common IF between them. So what they did is they're just completely separate. This is running about 40 to 60 megahertz, and this is running about 50 to 70 megahertz. And they just keep them far enough spaced away so they didn't even have to worry about that at first. The set runs on a single power supply. Well, obviously there's the high voltage for the CRT, but the set runs on a single 1,000 volt power supply. And the reason they had to do that is, even though the horizontal scan frequency is only about 2.8 kilohertz, because of the inductances they were working with, they needed a high voltage to get the sweep they needed. So they needed 1,000 volts. So why not use it to run the whole set by using 100-watt resistors to drop the voltage to the typical 230 volts to the rest of the chassis. So the set's filled with giant power resistors just giving off heat when you run it. It's all 2.5 volt AC tubes, except for there's two 10s in it. Just an interesting point. It's 54 amps to run the filaments of all the tubes on it at the 2.5 volts. So let's go now. One of the things that the set, it used, and for some reason, I guess I can get into that. Back in the summer of 2014, somebody had contacted Steve with some documentation that he had. And he said, what do you think of this? And Steve sent it to me. And it was a partial schematic of the prototype before this set. And it used gas styrotrons for the line and frame oscillators. For some reason, this set uses Dynatron oscillators, which are horrible oscillators. They're not characterized. They're using basically the undocumented characteristic of a tetrode. And that's the other thing, is this set has all original 224s and that style 227s. You can't use the A tubes because they purposely got rid of the second, or tried to suppress the second emissions. So the 24 hertz vertical and the 2.8 kilohertz horizontal is running using Dynatron 24s. So it's not terribly stable with those. And I don't know why they switched from gas styrotrons. But anyway, so this gentleman got a hold of Steve, and he saw these schematics look really interesting. And Steve, pursued it over the summer, and it just didn't go anywhere. The guy wouldn't respond to us much. January of 2015, I'm sitting here bored one night, skimming eBay, and an auction pops up, and it's a picture of that schematic. And I'm like, wow, that's the one that Steve had showed me in the summer. So I look into it, and there's about 10 pictures the guy has on this site. And it's at a pawn shop in Tucson, Arizona. So I get on the phone the next day, and I said, talk with the guy, and I said, I really, what's in this package that you're selling? He's asking $4,000 or best offer, and he admitted he had no clue, so he just threw a number out there. But he gave me the gentleman's name that had it. Turns out, it took me a while to finally get in contact with the guy. His wife was the daughter of Thomas DeHaven, and we'll talk about him in just a second here. But let me go ahead and see if we can't make it do something here. Okay. So obviously we need to go through a converter for this. And let's get over to, okay. So now I can keep talking because this set takes a little while to warm up and stabilize. And you can see so I end up talking with the guy at the pawn shop, and I said, look, I would like to get this, but I don't want to pay for something if it's just a bunch of stuff I'm not interested in. And he says, well, money back guarantee, buy it. You don't like it, send it back and give you all your money back. So I thought, okay, let's give it a shot and see what happens. So I got all this stuff in, and are we hooked up here? Let's see. Yep. There we go. Starting to get some audio. So I get this box about a week later and start opening it up and going through it. And there's lots of stuff in there on facsimile from this Thomas DeHaven. And I'm like, well, this is interesting, 1928, 1929. He worked at GE, and then he worked at RCA. And it's like, yeah, it's kind of interesting, but, not really. Some optical stuff. Then I start digging through, and it turns out Thomas DeHaven was the lead engineer on this project. And this turned out to be, he had two, he was lucky. He got two sets, and one at work and one at home. And this was one of his sets. So it was just phenomenal. And you'll see some of the documentation that ended up turning up for this set. So the vertical takes the longest to finally stabilize. I guess 24 hertz on a Dynatron isn't the best thing out there. But the picture is, it's bright and clear. It flickers. I don't know how bad can you see it. Yeah, you can kind of see it in the thing there. So this is the test image from 1931. Yeah, let's go ahead and put something up on there. Let's see here. A little better with the so you can see it's a little hard to see as I'm looking at the tablet here, but there's a considerable amount of flicker in real life. But again, this is quite impressive from a mechanical TV of the time. So I think part of the reason is, and you'll see a picture here in a minute, this set couldn't have been used much. Basically, they used it for tests in 1931 and 1932. 1932 was the big test that got publicized because that was done by NBC out of New York. And that's the one where in May, they brought in all the RCA licensees to show them the set working and show them what their technology was at. But DeHaven was actually running internal tests out of Camden all through through the second half of 1931. So the set could not have gotten used much. And the CRT, now this is actually, once again, Chuck Azzolina had found me, this is not the original CRT, I have the original CRT put away. It works just as good too. This is a second one that was dated about 2 weeks after the one that was found in the set. So it's kind of nice to have a backup for this. So if we look here, so DeHaven, as I mentioned, was the lead engineer for this project. And he was also hugely involved in facsimile work for RCA. So one of the things that we couldn't figure out on the back of this set is the audio chassis has a switch on it where you can turn the speaker off, and then there's binding posts where the audio goes out. Well, in his drawings, that was for facsimile, so he could use the radio in this for facsimile work. So obviously they were repurposing and doing things, whatever they could. He was big into going around and seeing what the competition was doing. So he would go to all the radio shows. He would come back and basically report, here's the state of, the technology right now. Here's where, mechanical TV is. Basically, being the lead engineer on it. So this is all just generic stuff on his work at RCA and what he was doing in the television development. Now, he worked with Alexanderson at GE, and then he came over with the GE, RCA taking over GE and the television development. So this is just a binder of all his basically television related work. So here, here's some of this is one of the prototypes that precedes this set. And it's probably a little hard to tell, but some of these are very crudely put together. They were thrown together, and you'll see a picture like this one here. You can see they just used, Steve, that CPA set you look at, it's not much different than what they were doing back then to just put something together on using just, rack material. But they did a demonstration in 1929. So this was all the mechanical sets. They lined them all up, a GE Octagon. Some of these I don't recognize. I don't know if they were one-offs or they were internal projects or whatever. So they lined up all the electronics, the mechanical sets, same thing. And then electronic set, more mechanical, the Octagon. There's the RE45, the NBC RCA one from earlier. This almost looks like the prototype for this set, where they did it from the earlier work that Zworykin had done, but I don't recognize exactly where that one came from. And then a picture of them with their lids open. So he was doing these presentations basically for the brass at GE or at RCA, showing them, here's where we're at, here's what we're doing. It doesn't sound like these sets here, these electronic sets, that they were ever actually that functional. They were more just laboratory curiosities that they were trying different things with. I don't know what that was. But yeah, there's the one of the photocell cabinets. So one of the things, talking with his son-in-law, he was prolific at photography. He said he was a real photography buff. And he had all sorts of 16 millimeter movies that I'm like, what happened to those? And unfortunately, his son-in-law couldn't remember. He said he thinks he gave some of them away and threw some of them out. And this was back again in 2015, and his son-in-law and his daughter was very old and in ill health at the time. So that's why they were trying to sell these documents. So this is only touching the surface of what was in that. Like I say, there was so much stuff on facsimile. He was really into the facsimile stuff. So he came up with a bunch of different test patterns to be used, checking geometry and video performance. Some interesting symbols there. And then some pictures off the screen that he was working on. This is baseball was, boy, pretty low res to kind of read their Path News. So they say he was very, so even after this set, after the 30s, he was still involved, and he went around New York and would look again what the state of TV was, go to different displays. And again, because he was a photography buff, he would photograph it and then come back and report at RCA what the competition was doing. This was interesting. This was at Raymond's in New York. It's a Baird TV. He made note of that. He went in, just like people do now. Well, they used to before the kind of the internet age. When you go car shopping, you go in and get a brochure. He would go in and get brochures then, and he's got a lot of the brochures in here too that he picked up along the way, and then kind of some other stuff that he had. So anyway, that's his not necessarily related completely to that. This is the stuff that was basically related to the set. Now, how this came together is a miracle that the set was still around, and this stuff showed up one night on eBay. And this is an interesting paper. So originally, the RCA engineer who had this set had talked to an NBC engineer who said he thought there was about 4 to 6 sets. Well, he was thinking of the NBC effort, the field test, not necessarily what DeHaven was doing back in Camden. So this is a list of 16 sets and who's got them. So Kell has got one. Here's his address. Engstrom, Zworkin, Beers, DeHaven. So he's got one at home, and then he's got one at work. WRG Baker had one, and how far away they are, and the distance, so they could be doing the evaluations. Chicken scratch, pricing things out, trying to figure out how much each of the different chassis is going to cost. Here's an actual now to the pricing for each of the chassis, the kinescope unit, the SPU, the cabinet. So $340, and that was not the receivers or the scanning chassis. So that was pretty darn expensive in July of 31. So he's got lots of this stuff. Here's an actual work order to the shop. I need 17 horizontal deflection chassis, 17 horizontal assemblies, just all the different pieces for the set. Some hand-drawn schematics as they were working out the electronics. Then he actually has he has both a hand-done operating instruction manual and a service manual. And that's the only there's no nomenclature on the set anywhere, so it's just called the pre-commercial television. Interesting in this is most of the tubes were known, because all the tubes were missing, as I mentioned, except the CRT. All the tubes were known from the IRE papers, except a couple that he just mentioned, pentodes. And that was just figured out now last year that they were actually space charge pentodes. There's actually extra leaf spring contacts on 2 of the sockets where they came up and contacted a screw that was sticking out of the side of the base of the tube. And this is the service notes now on the set. Picture of the set. Again, there's no nomenclature, so there's no markings on the set of what knob does what. But he had pictures and he labeled them all, what all the controls do on the front and on the back. So here is the sound chassis and sound radio output. And there's a switch on there marked speaker and fax. So he was, like I say, really into facsimile even while he was doing the television development. He thought, well, heck, I can use this receiver chassis to do my facsimile work. And pictures of the power supplies. Just lots of correspondence between him, Angstrom, Zorkin, Kell, suppliers as he was getting looking for parts. Where are the resistors I ordered on such and such a date? And another thing he did is now, and this is the thing where, like I said, we always assumed that it was a 32 trial. In 31, he was running a trial out of Camden. So he did these sheets, which were basically, any change notices that were going along. And then people had like a little, it was the engineers, but they had a little reader's response thing that they would fill out and tell them they liked this, didn't like that, what was working, what wasn't. And then in October of 31, on the last one, I think it was like Bulletin 15, he said, okay, next week you're losing your set because I'm collecting them all because they got to get them retrofitted to go up to NBC field test. So that was the one that happened in 32. These are interesting. His hand drawing in April of 31 of this set and how the chassis are going to lay out in the cabinet with dimensions, both from the front and side view. So he figured exactly how everything was going to fit and what the basic layout was going to be. And they kept right to that. Again, lots of work orders, engineering, hand-drawn for the different deflection and amplifier. It's just amazing that this stuff was still around someplace. Now, this is the schematic that he had originally, David's son-in-law had originally sent Steve and that I saw. And it's like, wow, that's, 1930. This is the one before this set. It's the same deflection units, but they use gas thyrotrons instead of the dynatrons. So that's what started this whole thing out, is when he showed us that. And then these are actually the drawings that were used then. If you look at the IRE papers, this was the drawings that they used in the IRE papers that he just drew out to show basically, without specifically labeling anything, how it all went together. And then more engineering and just different notes. So again, just quite the stroke of luck that this stuff still existed, didn't get thrown out, and ended up back with the set. And the fact that it was one of his sets. So that's kind of it. Any questions or?
Darryl?
Yes.
What was the green phosphor on that set?
It looks darn much like a P1. I mean, it looks like the same color. There's no other hint of a different color. I haven't, used a colorimeter on it to actually measure it, but to the eye, it definitely looks like P1. The persistence looks about the same too, given 24 hertz, frame rate.
Darryl?
Yes.
Some people had mentioned the TRK 12s that were at the World's Fair. Mm-hmm. Steve McVoy might remember that he sent me on a mission to Long Island some years ago when a family thought they had one of the ones that had been at the fair. And they had a whole family story. The TV had been in the family's bar. They owned it for years. Then eventually, after the war, and the newer sets came out, it went back to their home. And so I went out to check it out, and every label inside was TRK 120. And from what I was able to find out in researching that was that RCA had kind of done buy a service contract. We'll update your TV on a regular basis. So what I think they did for line rate and maybe the channel, get it up to 2 to 13, was just come and swap the whole set.
Oh,
and
okay.
I think that's might have been what ended up happening to a lot of the original TRK.
The original 12s, yeah.
Well, yeah.
I wonder at the World's Fair, because it lasted obviously through 40. I wonder if they swapped any of them out that were on display there for 120s, or if they probably not. If they modified them, they probably just stuck with them. And I have a list.
Apparently, the family said they bought it at an auction after the fair was closing up.
I somewhere in the documentation I've got here, I've got a list of World's Fair stuff that RCA had, and it was basically a list of spares. So many CRTs, so many high voltage rectifiers, so many are to be on hand at all times, so they could swap them out. So yeah, I would imagine they kept the same TRK 12s there and just kept changing parts out as they needed to.
Yeah.
I don't know much about this stuff, but I have a question. You mentioned earlier on in your tour the 5 pre-war TVs were all made by RCA, even though they were different brands. Why would they have done that? Why would they have helped those other companies?
Well, it was RCA was trying to push. They had a lot of money invested into the development of television, and they were trying to get their money back by getting television out into the public. Sears, they probably figured there was no way Sears was ever going to actually sell them, at least at that time. So it was more just a gimmick. There's actually a flyer, I didn't show it, of come see, I forget where the store was at, someplace in New York, come and see the Sears, television display. Westinghouse was actually pretty big there on their own in electronics. So it probably was maybe more of a partnership between them that they wanted. But again, none of the Westinghouses were actually sold to the public. So it was just for display at the World's Fair. And I think it was promotion for RCA. They wanted to get television out of there and start recuperating their money.
But if like Westinghouse had a TV on display at the World's Fair, wouldn't RCA like to know? I mean, did it say thanks to them? Because it seems like if you helped your competitors look like you were keeping up with them, they would be like, yeah, you'd think it used the opportunity to say, yeah, we're like miles ahead of you or something.
Yeah, I kind of doubt that Westinghouse or Sears advertised the fact that they were RCA sets.
Hey, Darryl.
Now, yes.
I happened to do some research on Westinghouse. In fact, I had done a big presentation, and in the time when the TVs would have been built, even their factories that were supposed to be doing radio stuff were under these big government contracts for war contracts, commercial equipment, and one that was supposed to be building radios was building the early radar sets.
Okay,
so they just didn't have time to
exactly.
Think
okay,
about that. Yep. They even made a comment at the time. This would have been, 1940-ish, that they had already done more business in radio with government orders than they had in their entire history in radio since the 1920s. So that was just, they couldn't get involved in it at the time.
Yep. And you look at it, Westinghouse really wasn't one of the players in the early development. There were obviously, GE and RCA and Dumont and some of the smaller players, Emerson, and that at least they played in it some. Westinghouse really never even, like you said, they were probably so busy on other things, they didn't have time to.
Well, they gave Zworykin's to Sarnoff. He was working there. Zworykin's first job at Westinghouse was to build the filament mass production for the WD-11 tubes. So he was a engineer there, putting his spare time into television. And when Westinghouse subcontracted out all their radio manufacturing, they didn't need Zworykin anymore, so Sarnoff took him and the team.
Yep. Yeah. So it was just a sales gimmick, I guess. They didn't want to be left behind at the World's Fair.
Hearing Mike talk about WD-11, here's mine. Here's one of mine right here. So
there you go.
Very timely, Mike. I would only add to the question, to the answer. RCA made a lot more money licensing its technology to others than it did in selling. Even in radio, it was always number 4 or 5 in terms of unit sales because it was making money on every unit. So that continued in TV.
Exactly. Yeah. And they had spent a ton getting to that point.
Hey, Darryl, I want to go back for a second. You were talking about the Philco 5-inch set.
Actually, I think it was a 6. Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned that they shot the 8.2 megahertz IF so obviously they were expecting you to receive that on a shortwave receiver.
Yeah. So
that's weird.
Kind of it's clever though, because now you didn't even need a detector in the TV. They literally just took the IF signal and stuck it out a piece of wire.
It just seems strange because you figure, okay, people might have a broadcast receiver, but to have a shortwave receiver is another layer of specialty equipment you need to have through. And obviously that was AM then, right?
Oh yes, yeah,
yep. I never heard that before. That was
so wireless audio back in that era. Kind of, but you think they actually did? They had the wireless phonographs too at the time too, so it wasn't terribly novel, but it had to be more of a cost cutting thing too. Like I say, they really saved a lot of tubes. No detector, no preamp, no amp.
If you look at the early Philco TVs or radios from that period, there is a mark on the dial This is television near the 8 megahertz band section on a few of their high-end consoles.
Yep. So they were getting ready. Are there any other questions or?
Well, this is really great. If there's, too much virus in Columbus to go there, we'll all go to your house.
Sounds good. Pack them in. You got not enough room. Not every room's filled with TVs.
Or we'll go to your house, Mike. Darryl may have some nice stuff, but it's, in terms of quantity, stuff, I think you take the cake.
Tonnage.
Definitely.
All right. Well, that was absolutely extraordinary, Darryl. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So
very good. Thank you.
Job. Yep, you're welcome. It was fun.
Yeah, Darryl, thanks.
Chuck Azar talking. That was a presentation that would have been about the same as a presentation that we would have at the museum.
Yep.
Yeah. Very effective over Zoom, and that's as close to going to the museum for the symposium as any other presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was very good.
Like Dave said, it's better in some respects because, you're not going to drag all these sets someplace. So, it actually was an opportunity to see something you normally wouldn't.
Yeah.
So kind of a bonus.
Well, the presentation on that set was on that special set on that set with the that you had the green picture on at the end. That was definitely a presentation of one of the museum presentations.
Yeah, and that was kind of a real skim over because I didn't know how long. I don't have a clock on this. I have no idea what time it is right now.
It could have gone on forever.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I should have had something to know how we were doing here.
Yeah, well, we talked about whether we'd want to, continue doing these, and I don't think it's necessary to take a vote. I think this went real well.
Good.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree. And Darryl, thank you very much. That was really
you're welcome. Yeah, glad this worked out, and hopefully we'll have a lot more good ones like this.
Incredible.
How'd you do on people?
It's amazing that 44 people are still watching, to be honest
that's
with
what I said, yeah.
We're not zoomed out. So we lost about 10 over the course of a couple hours. So that's great.
Well, for those of us on the other side of the world, I can just say that it's been wonderful. And I've been a member for a few years now. And thanks to Steve McVoy's help to get my sets going. But this is a wonderful experience, and I'm looking forward to many more.
Okay. Steve, you want to play the national anthem and
put a test pattern on?
I'd like to just say that Dave's been on a few monitors, and I had a nightmare like that once when every time I looked at a monitor, Dave was on it.
Well, I can do the I can let's see, where's my
there you go.
There you go.
Oh, no.
I can do the test pattern. So that's it. I can't fake organ music though, but if somebody wants to hum it.
Darryl, did you pick the Ralph Buys a TV episode consciously, or was that just a happy coincidence?
No, I saw that was on there, so I picked that one.
The good one.
Yep.
Also, it's good seeing everybody's faces too.
Yeah, definitely.
Been too long.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, not to get maudlin, but we miss you guys.
Yeah, I miss you guys too.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks again to everybody.
In a month.
Thanks again to everybody for participating.
Thank Larry.
Yeah, I will thank Larry. I don't know if he's still around or not. My guess is that he got bored. But we'll see. I'll be talking to him tomorrow. Okay, good night, everybody.
Yep.
Good night, Steve.
Have a nice evening.
Yep.
Good night, everyone.
Everybody.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Night, John Boy.
Don't forget to turn off your set.